I think what we'll do is I will make a brief introduction and do a little reading of this work, and then introduce Nahida, who will sort of say a little bit more. How many of you are here because you saw the Plain Dealer article? Right next to the funnies. Okay. Thank you, welcome. Yeah, if you want.
Did you bring my books for me?
I did, absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Most important
Yes.
piece of business.
Yeah.
Welcome to Loganberry Books.
I know they're also that of your book upstairs, they need going.
Where? Which?
I don't mean upstairs, I mean up front.
Okay, I'll take care of that.
Just a puppy. Thank you for coming to Loganberry Books. I'm Harriet. I own Loganberry. We do lots of events with authors and esteemed guests and workshops and funny things like edible books competitions and a Knobs Forum series, which is conversations through the world of creating books, mostly the artisan work behind the books. I invite you to explore more and learn about it. Tonight we are very honored and pleased to have our two esteemed guests. It's a Poetry Month double feature tonight. Philip Metris is a poet translator scholar. You probably know him from his long tenureship at John Carroll and many books of poetry. Dr. Nahida Halaby Gordon is Professor Emerita of Improbability and Statistics at Case Western Reserve University. And they're the arrangers of how we do tit for tat in this double header, but please enjoy them as they read pieces of their work and see how they interplay and work together, and follow with a Q&A and wine and food reception afterwards. Books are available up front at the checkout counter. Buy them there, come back here to get them signed, which of course you'll want. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Amy, could you come up and could I have two more volunteers to help me read this poem? So this is a sequence of poems inspired by Nahida's story, which I heard for the first time in 2006. Can I have two more? Okay, thanks. Okay, great. Come on.
I'm shy, but I'll do it.
Thanks, Kate.
We have to read something we've never seen before.
Okay.
I don't have a voice, but I'll.
It's good to see you, Mike. Okay, can you all see this? Come closer. Sorry.
Okay. You know what? Glasses.
Okay. Okay.
Are we going in order?
So I want. Why don't you read this column since you're closest? You read this one.
Okay.
I'll read this one. He'll read this one. Does that make sense?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah. Do you think you can
I
read
can
that?
try.
Should we just get another one?
If you have another one.
Mike, get those
Can you
glasses.
read these simultaneously?
Yes.
Okay.
We got 'em,
So
we
all
got 'em.
four voices at once.
Already? Bill, is it pronounced Yaffa or Yaffa?
You pronounce it. Well, the Hebrew is Jaffa. And
That's
the
what I thought, yeah.
English is Jaffa, and the Arabic
Okay.
is Jaffa. So
What
take
page?
your pick. There you go.
This one? Oh, okay.
There you go. You're this one. This one. You're this one.
Okay. And what page?
This is page 9. Okay. This is a simultaneity, which means we're reading at the same time. Okay. One. This is called Bride of Palestine.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. 1, 2. Just read this part. Go.
Welcome to
Back then,
Yaffa.
we lived as
Welcome
though
Bride
it
of
happened
Palestine.
happened
follows.
yesterday.
City of
Oh,
oranges.
I'd fall
man.
asleep
Welcome to the Hive
to the
of
White House
Sunset
Yaffa
till dawn.
Studios,
Window.
Paris,
Look
They
at
did
that.
not
Street.
spare
A constant
Some
us.
say
pumping
Yaffa
from the
was named
explosion.
after Noah's son.
We
but
had
others
no
say
man
during
others
the
say
outside
that
to
the
help
Arabs
us.
named it Yaffa.
Outside
Shuffle
of
of their
Garage
feet
designed to
sound.
cause
Welcome
chaos
to
among
On the
Sheep
closet, a
Paris.
clean-shaven man in sharp
Flea
old
market
gray
is
suit,
chaos.
All
as if
persons
dressed
rated
for a
for
wedding.
social
Egyptian
identity.
If you do not want the same thing to happen to
mass
you
flight
as happened in
cause
theirs,
chaos,
Syrians,
create
Maccabees,
mass
also
flight,
say,
houses
Must
dynamited,
flee.
Romans,
cause
And
chaos,
all
in
down
order
bags
to
and
packed,
create
registers
mass
there
flight,
fly past
cause
houses,
chaos
in
in order to
flames,
create mass
houses
flight,
in
So that any
cause
plane
chaos
down
in order to
houses
create
in
mass
flames.
flight,
Jonah embarked
Without
unknown
those
number,
documents, I
drowned
could
their
never
access
prove
by
I
sea.
lived there, that this house was mine, and this life was mine.
Thanks. The epigraph of this book is by David Ben-Gurion from his war diaries. I couldn't understand, he wrote, why did the inhabitants of Jaffa leave? May 18, 1948. A lot of these poems are related directly to the testimony that Nahida gave in her, well, first orally and then in various places, and then formalized in her book. And one of the things that I wanted to try to capture was the feeling of hearing this testimony and trying to understand it in the context of everything else that I could understand about everything that had happened in Israel and Palestine during the period in which she was living. She was born in 1939, if I'm not mistaken, in Jerusalem, and was living in Jaffa, and left when the violence was so bad that the church was bombed across from her house. And so I wanted to see if I could capture the strange combination of historical event and personal anecdote. And I wanted just to say before I read anything else that obviously there are many stories to tell about the Middle East, about Israel, about Palestine, and this is but one of them. This is not the whole truth, but this is one person's truth. And it's a truth that I hadn't heard before and was astonished by and struck by for a lot of reasons. And that's why I felt that I wanted to work with it in some way and to sort of abide with it so I could understand a little bit more about her journey and the predicament of her life as a refugee and of the life of everyone who's displaced or exiled or dispossessed. So that's just a little bit of background. Again, I'm finishing a book actually sort of about various stories and voices from Israel and Palestine, and I'm always interested in hearing your stories and your perspectives as well. So I invite you to share them with me afterwards, or we can talk more in a Q&A. So this section is called The Palestinian Refugees PowerPoint, and it oscillates between voices, and each time I switch registers, I'll just snap my fingers so you know it's kind of a different register, okay? But she doesn't look like a refugee, my student said, eyeing her grandmotherly cardigan, her gray-black coif, and new laptop. I've asked her to tell her story, but on PowerPoint, it is 1948. I am 9. I'll tell you only what I know. She's mired in last century, laser-pointing Balfour and Rothschild, Sykes and Picot. I know a pain behind my ribs when I cast back the diminishing green of Palestine on map after digital map into the river of remember. Tremor of explosion, as if clicking past resolutions and broken accords, trying to piece together near the town center, January 4, and my father there, and now a shrapnelled map, a forensic scientist examining her own body, trying to explain in the bathroom, his black hair ash white, my mother combing out the stones and gathering her strength to touch the hurting place. Her hand quaking, his blue suit chalk white, his silk tie, and my sophomores, soporific from history, slip into a dream, soaked red, and I'm asking why, or glance at their screens, seeing or not seeing. Years later, his hand still holding the last Haganah leaflet, what it takes her to return, fallen from the sky. One of the things that really struck me about the story that she told and the images that she gave was this particular leaflet that was signed 13 May 1948. the contents of which I'm not going to share entirely with you, but it's reproduced in the book. I felt like it was a historical document of great import, and I'll share a touch of it in just a moment, but just wanted to let you know that this is kind of a documentary poem. There are 3 returns in this story, and they mark 3 sort of emblematic attempts to sort of come back to the place where she once lived, her home on Ajami Street. This is return 1. First, it was a restaurant. Next door, a woman sat smoking. Did she feel guilty about living in someone else's home? No, I have had a hard life, and I deserve this apartment. I was born on a kibbutz, and life was hard there. This is an ode to the oranges of Jaffa. The epigraph is from Nahida, which she emailed to me. I asked her if she had any memories of them. She said, "My father used to buy the ones too large to ship. We'd scoop the insides and eat it, and then make jack-o'-lanterns out of them." Apparently, at one point, even in the 19th century, there were like tens of millions of them were shipped all over the world. They were a huge industry. And after the war, they became one of the ways that the New Israel was able to sustain itself. And now, unfortunately, there's actually a documentary about the orange groves, and apparently they're sort of really down to the last of it. And there are some local farmers there who are trying to hold on with every last bit. Ode to the oranges of Jaffa. For your oval and thick-peeled, easy to remove. For your seedless and tough-skinned and suitable for export. For your juice starts sweet, then runs bitter. For naranj comes from Sanskrit, meaning fruit like elephants. Memory the earth you come from, and perfume the whole city when wind pages through your leaves. For by 1845, 38 million shipped to farther shores. Then symbol of Arab-Jewish cooperation before the war, then orange engine of the new Israel. For the last Jew to grow them now says, quote, "To cut the orchard down would be to cut out my heart." Return 2. Then years later, it was an apartment complex. When my father remodeled the property before the war, he built a secret chamber within the steps, placing several bottles of wine he planned to serve at his children's weddings. The steps were now gone. There's a little picture of the house on Ajami, which Nahida shared. And she may say more about that. Return 3. And then it was a shop, more apartments. The shop was called the Israeli Experience. I asked the owner, what about the Palestinian experience? He became enraged, told me I knew nothing. One occupant, however, allowed us into her home. We sat and reminisced about the house as though it were a common acquaintance. She thought the church had owned it. We talked politics, rising fascism, her family's escape from pogroms. I felt her suffering. In a different time, we could have been friends. When I got up to leave, I hugged her, and she returned my hug. This is close-up from the Haganah leaflet. Any male wishing to leave may apply to my representative for a permit to do so. Likewise, any male Arab who left Jaffa and wishes to return to Jaffa may apply for a permit to do so. Permits will be granted after their bona fides have been proved, provided the commander of the Haganah is convinced the applicants will not at any time constitute a threat to peace and security. This will be done with the cooperation of the representatives of the Arab population who will function in an advisory capacity. 9, all public documents, municipal and government, must be kept intact, and all documents and registers therein must be kept safely and in good condition, so any claims of residence may be checked. 10, the removal or transfer of any property within the area defined must be previously authorized by my representative, etc., etc. 19, this is from online, about the Municipal Historical Archives. The Municipal Historical Archives are the historical archives of the municipality of Tel Aviv-Yafo from the founding of the Achuzat Bait Association, I'm sorry, I mispronounced that, in 1906 until about 1990. The collections of the archives reflect the history of the city in all fields in which the municipality is involved, matters of education and culture, construction, gardens, religion, etc. The municipal archives also contains private papers. The collections include also maps from the beginning of the 20s, historical photographs and publications of the municipality and posters. The archives is the center of information of the history of the city and is open to all. Workers of the archives will answer with pleasure questions about the collections and will provide historical information if its location does not require lengthy search. Unfortunately, the majority of the archives of the municipality of Jaffa prior to 1948 have been lost. Okay, this is the last section I'll read. This is called Tabitha Arise, and there are 3 voices here. And I'll try to do a better job at distinguishing them. The first part will be the voice of the official record, the official flyers. The middle will be biblical, and the right will be Nahida's voice. So, Tabitha, arise. Outside those enclosures, normal life. In Jaffa, I attended Tabitha School for Girls, named after a girl brought back from death. Now there was at Jaffa a certain disciple named Tabitha, full of good works and alms deeds. A pink pen mark along the left margin highlights the passage. All public offices must be kept intact and all documents and registers therein. We escaped by car in April 1948, shortly after Jaffa fell. The houses in flames, and it came to pass in those days that she was sick and died, must be kept safely and in good condition. They must have destroyed those documents. I could never prove that I lived there, that this house was mine, that this life was mine. Then Peter went with them, and all the widows stood by weeping. The registrar of Tabitha's school had saved a few registers. When she heard I was looking, she had not forgotten. Will endeavor to assist you. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. 60 years later, she showed me the book, and opened it. I could see my name. Will endeavor to assist you. And I could see my name until normal life. My name alongside my classmates' names until normal life. I held it in my palms. I existed still to see my name. Will endeavor to assist you in someone's hand. Will endeavor to assist you. And it was known throughout Jaffa, Nahida, Halaby. So here she is. Thank you for joining us for this, and for telling your story and honoring us with a living history. So I don't know what you wanted to say, what you wanted to share from your book. She published a book in 2016 called Palestine is Our Home, which involved both personal research, interviews, some of her own story, a little bit of background and history, and an attempt to sort of gather together some voices of, as the subtitle says, of lost courage and steadfastness. So,
Thank you very much. I'm honored and touched. The way you presented the story was really quite poetic, and I think better than anything I could have done. It was wonderful. I'm a statistician and mathematician by training, and I tend to write things in a very concise, almost scientific way, and I loved listening to the way you wrote the story. It was wonderful. Thank you. A little bit about the book. The whole idea for this book was to try and make the story of Palestinians known to the American people. Our story is seldom heard, and when it is, we're mischaracterized. So the book consists first of a very concise history, about 15-20 pages of the history of the conflict, and including a lot of artistic pictures. I thought actually art would portray events a lot better and ideas a lot better than actual photographs. I then followed it by 22 narratives. Mine was one of them. And I did a lot of thinking, how should I organize these narratives? Should I do them by chronicles, by alphabetical order, the author's name, or should I do them by year? I decided what I should do is arrange them by the district from which the person came. Palestine had something like 16 districts, and the book starts with a map of the districts of Palestine in 1946. And I start in the middle of Palestine and sort of rotated around. So the first section was Jerusalem. I had 6 narratives from Jerusalem, and these varied. Some were Christian, some were Muslim. I tried not to let the reader know what was what, because I don't think it really makes much difference. And some of these people were from Palestinians who were exiled in 1948, some 1967 during what we call the Nakba. That's during the 67 war, when Israel then took the rest of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza. And at that time also Sinai Desert and the Golden Heights. Also, there were some that had nothing to do with the 67 or the 48 Exodus, but were represented different aspects of Palestinian life. There is a chapter on prisoners, and the narrative here is about a woman who was elected as a member of the municipal council of Nablus. And 6 years afterwards, the Israel made that list as illegal. So they arrested her and put her in prison. And they can put you in prison for 6 months at a time using something called administrative detention. And they could renew it at any time they want. And in her case, poor woman, it was renewed 4 times. Other chapters in here, one of them was about a massacre in Qalqilia, which is quite fascinating. It was written by my sister. She has come up with a book of illustrations of the massacre in Qalqilia, which occurred in 1956. Just very briefly, Qalqilia used to be part of Jordan. And in the 1949 armistice, King Hussein, or rather, sorry, at the time, Abdullah gave a strip of land next to the West Bank to Israel. And this little village suddenly became part of Israel. In 1956, when Israel attacked the Suez Canal, under the cover of war, France, England, and Israel attacked Egypt. Under that cover, they then decided they wanted to take a region around Kafr Qasim and get all of the people out of the area. So, to make a long story short, they declared a curfew at 4:45, and most everybody was still out in the fields, and as they were coming home, they shot over 50 people. There are several photographs and pictures about the massacre. Another chapter was on the art of the Intifada, the first 50 years of art in Palestine. And the last chapter, which was dear to my heart, was about embroidery. Palestinian embroidery is very much valued in Palestine, and different villages had different designs, and you could tell where a woman came from by the way she embroidered her dress. That's a very brief outline of what's in the book, and I don't know how much time. Let me read a few things from my narrative to supplement what Phil said. Okay. A few of my childhood memories will draw a picture of the atmosphere then. An atmosphere filled with attention among the adults in our lives and among the visitors to our home. Our house was adjacent to the old city and near the waterfront. a few hundred yards from the Jaffa Lighthouse. Its sweeping light would shine through the door transoms from the veranda, and I could watch it at night as I was falling asleep. It was a constant comfort. It made me feel safe and from the chaos outside. In the spring of 1948, we fell asleep at night to the sound of bombs aimed at Jaffa. In my childish memory and imagination, the bombs sounded like large pipes being thrown around by huge giants. The memory is still strong and vivid to this day. It was frightening, and going to sleep was difficult. And I have a picture of the lighthouse as it exists today. Unfortunately, it doesn't work anymore. And also a picture of my school, the school of Tabitha. I say Tabitha, not Tabitha. At least that's the way we pronounce it then. Other memories. Snatches of sound and sight from this period persist vividly in my mind to this day. A historical background to one of my most frightening memories is a description I read in Adam Lebor's book titled City of Oranges. On January 4, 1948, a truck piled high with oranges was parked in an alley off Clock Tower Square alongside the new Sarai, which housed Jaffa's municipal offices, welfare workers, and a kitchen for needy children. My father's office was in the Clock Tower Square. Soon after the truck driver and his companion left, a thunderous explosion shook the city. Broken glass and shattered masonry blew out across Clock Tower Square. The new Sarai collapsed in a pile of rubble. Windows shattered for yards around, and a thick, choking cloud of dust billowed out. After a moment of silence, the screams and moans began. 26 were killed and hundreds injured. Most were civilians, including many children who had been eating at the charity kitchen. There was Israeli terrorism. That day, my mother was nervous. It was cold outside, with a persistent drizzling rain with thunder mixed in with the sound of explosions. She was worried because father was late arriving home. We heard a car drive up the street. She asked me to run out to the veranda to see if it was father. He had come into the side gate and garaged his car. When I arrived at the veranda and looked over the parapet, I saw him walking below me. He had his overcoat on with the collar turned up high. He had what looked like a dirty handkerchief around his forehead, and his hair was smoky white. I ran in to tell mother that it was indeed father, and that he was dirty and had pebbles in his hair. My next memory is looking into the bathroom, and you described that very nicely. Father was standing over the washstand, and mother was trying to clean him up. His necktie and shirt were soaked in blood. He had grit and dirt all over his face and hair. The handkerchief was one lent to him by a fellow victim, was also soaked in blood. My father, the anchor and keeper of our lives, had just survived a Zionist terror bombing. He was wounded, but he remained behind to help some of those wounded to the hospital. Here's one he didn't mention. I'll read it. One day I heard a noise outside on the street. I ran to the balcony outside my brother's bedroom, which faced the street. I saw a coffin cover carried vertically by a man who was walking down the street towards me. The cover had a cross down the entire length. Following the coffin cover was the coffin itself, being carried by 6 pallbearers. The noise I heard was the shuffle of the feet on the pavement. As the coffin arrived just below me, I saw its occupant, a very young, smooth-faced man. He was incredibly beautiful and peaceful. He was dressed in charcoal gray pants with pinstripes and a black jacket. He looked as though he was dressed for his wedding, which was never to be. And the funeral cortege continued to move below me and then went to the yard of the Church of St. Simon, which was further down the street towards the waterfront. Simon, or Simeon actually, was a man who was a tanner, who was believed to live actually very close to where my house is. And the church is built on a site where his shop is believed to have been. And Simon was the man that Peter visited, and he had a dream that a lot of animals came down on a sheet, and the voice told him to eat the animals, which was not kosher for Jews. And he was surprised that that voice told him that, and he interpreted that to mean that he should go and visit the house of Cornelius, who was a Roman and a Gentile. In a sense, that was the beginning of inclusivity of Christianity. Nothing seemed safe anymore. Days later, during the night, the bombs fell across the street and hit St. Simon Church, where the funeral of that young man was held. A few feet further northeast, and they would have hit our house. During my last visit there, which was in October of 2018, there was a wedding at the church, which I thought was rather interesting, just across, actually quite close to where my house is, and just across the street. And what would we have experienced had we stayed in Jaffa? We left around April 22 or 23, as I recall. Going back to the Board City of Oranges, by April 26, which was just 3 days after we left, 1948, using the tons of shells that the Irgun had taken from the British munition stream. The Irgun was an arm of the Yishuv. The Yishuv is a word describing the Israeli armed forces. The Haganah was another branch.
Prior to the declaration of the state.
Yes, prior to the state. The Haganah became what you know now as the Israeli Defense Forces. The battle for Jaffa began in the early hours of Sunday, April 25. The reason Jaffa was so much sought after is because the partition, the crazy partition, which I don't have time to mention, had Jaffa to be a Palestinian city amongst an entire region which was supposedly given to Israel. So they were very interested in taking it away from the Palestinians. Irgun gunners directed a steady rain of mortar fire onto the city. In theory, the gunners were not supposed to target hospitals, religious sites, or consulates. In practice, the shells fell indiscriminately across Clock Tower Square, smashing into the markets and south into the heart of Ajami, which is where my house is. Killing and wounding large numbers of civilians, panic and hysteria swept through the city. How could we have known that we had missed this tragedy by just 3 days? One part of the document that Philip mentioned, I don't know if you read this, but item 10 said the following. Sorry, the fourth article said the following. A. All males in the area defined in the agreement will concentrate in the area between Faisal Street, Al-Mukhtar Street, and Al-Halwa Street, and the C, until everybody has been identified themselves under agreements, the particulars of which will be notified later. And B, during this, any male found outside this area will be severely punished unless in possession of a special permit. Now, before this, the British did the same thing, and the Israelis did that a lot. They would congregate men and boys in an area, they put them in trucks, take them somewhere else and dump them, or sometimes they try and take them to the Lebanese border and dump them. So if we had been there, at that time I had 2 teenage brothers. They would have taken my brothers and my father and would have left me and my sister and mother alone. We would have been stranded. So we missed that by a few days. And what they did to those people then is they pushed them out to the sea. A lot of them boarded boats, some went to Lebanon, and a lot went to Gaza. A lot of the refugees in Gaza came from Jaffa. And if they didn't move fast enough, they shot at them. I have some paintings in here which show what happened, and the artist is a woman who actually lived in a house behind our house and experienced the thing herself. So
Is this the artist?
the artist, yes, the wife of
There's a
Ishmael Shamot.
particularly poignant story about her. Do you know the story that she? Obviously, she's an artist of some renown, and
Tamam al-Akhal,
Tamam, her house has been made into
an
an
artist.
Israeli gallery, if I'm
Yes.
not mistaken. So you know about that?
Yes, I do. She was a friend of my sister,
Okay, yeah.
and we actually went into the place when we were there in 2010.
Apparently it's a gorgeous house, and
Yeah, those
Okay.
old city houses were all gorgeous.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm digressing.
you're allowed.
I can't remember which trip. My sister and I were walking around up into the old city. Our house was adjacent to the old city. And there was a group of American tourists with an Israeli guide. And the Israeli guide said, "Oh, look at all these houses. They were built by Rabbi so-and-so and so-and-so. None of them, of course, were Palestinian." Everything what she was saying was totally wrong. So, of course, I couldn't stay quiet. I made it clear that these houses are Palestinian houses. And my sister, who's much more vocal than I am, started putting her stick on the ground and saying, "These are Palestinian homes, these are Palestinian homes." And the tourists just looked. They were amazed, and the guide was very embarrassed. So, and I almost passed up, and I got so angry. Okay. Well, let me tell you about just my last visit, or the visit in 2010. My brother was with us then, and actually the pastor of my church and his wife and a few friends from church were with us. And my apartment, my house was turned into 15 apartments and a few little stores facing the sea. My brother went to the front of the building. He pressed every buzzer, all 15 of them. And one woman answered, and he told her who he was. And he said, "We'd love to come in and look." And she was quite, I have to hand it to her, she was quite brave to let us in, and she did. We had a wonderful visit with her. She's the woman that Philip mentioned in his poem. She was very progressive in her thinking and told us that she owns a home in Jerusalem, but doesn't want to live there because Jerusalem was becoming very fascist. So she decided she'd rather live in Jaffa, and she's renting the house. And she told us, "I'm renting the house from the Catholic Church." Now, the old city, there's sort of like a hill behind our house, and there are all the houses in the old city, and there is a big, what we say there in Arabic, a convent, a Catholic convent, and properties. It sort of really dominates the area. She thought they were the owners, and she was renting them, the house from them. We explained to her that that's not true, that this used to be our house, and the absentee property laws of Israel basically took the house from us. I don't know who owns the house and who she was really paying rent to. She told us that her parents came in the 20s from Pinsk, which is in eastern Russia, and basically she said, "I just want to live a normal life." And my reaction was, how can she live in a normal life when she's living in a stolen house, and I felt a stolen country? I really felt for her, and we hugged at the end, and I think we could have been friends under different circumstances. So the history of Palestine, I'd like to say this is very important, hasn't been always like what you hear on the news. In the first part of the 20th century, Jews, Muslims, and Christians loved to celebrate each other's holidays and religious ceremonies. To this day, you look in Bethlehem, it's almost 90% Muslim. They love Christmas. They join in what we do for Christmas. Of course, Christmas is fun. So, and the old city, if you've been there, it's divided into Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Armenian quarters. It was never like that before the British came. They're the ones who divided into quarters. They're the ones who sought dissension between the different ethnic groups and religious groups, which is really unfortunate. So I end my narrative by saying, for centuries, Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived together peacefully in Palestine. This Palestine and many others only wish for the two people to live together in this land which they both call their own, which should be one land where they all enjoy equal rights, with equal access to political, legal, economic, cultural, religious, and educational rights. And the reality today is that the Christians and Muslims in Israel, as well as in the West Bank, are third-class citizens. The human rights violations by the government of Israel are appalling, and I entreat all of you to look into this yourselves. The Presbyterian Church just passed an overture which explained all of this in detail. So I echo the wish of the Israeli woman who is currently living in one of the apartments of my former house. I wish we both can live a normal life and united as human beings in common suffering of our humanity. There's lots more. I can talk all day, but I don't think you want to hear me all day. So thank you very much.
Love to take questions, comments. Yes, thanks.
I have a question. Comment. Phil, you mentioned living in someone else's house, and you mentioned about your house, and you referred to my house. And it strikes me as so incredible that a very dear friend of mine who's a Holocaust survivor, after she was liberated from Auschwitz, she and her mother went back to their original town. They were the only two survivors, and there were people living in her apartment. And they let them in, her and her mother in, to see it, but they were very careful. They didn't want them to take anything. It was not their furniture. It was nothing belonged to them. It belonged to my friend and her mother. And my friend Ida picked up a knife from the silverware set, and she said, "I'm going to take this." He said, "No, you'll wreck our set of silverware." She said, "I'm taking it," and she has the only thing that she has left. But so striking that the parallel experiences, and Phil's heard me say this before, that my son and his 4 children live in Jerusalem. I've been to Jaffa many times. I don't understand why what has happened had to happen. I just don't get it. And I'm sorry for you, and I'm sorry for all of the people who had their houses and their lives taken away from them. I don't understand it.
So what do you think the solution should be?
I have no solution. I do know that my 4 grandchildren, the oldest is almost 20, that they're different from their grandparents, from their Israeli grandparents. I don't like to hear what they say about the other people. But my son's generation and the next generation, I think, are learning much more, and I think they're much more tolerant and much more interested in peace. That's just partly my wish and partly.
Well, I think Israel has taken the West Bank and Israel and Gaza, and they're living under occupation. It's brutal. I mean, you should go visit and see for yourself. And my reaction is, it's become one country. Granted, parts of it are under occupation, and granted, the Palestinians and Israel do not have the really equal rights. There's a lot of discrimination, housing, education, etc. What we need is, as I said at the last sentence I read, what we need is for both peoples to live together, respect each other, and have the same rights, political, religious, civic, etc. But more important than that, if you really want to solve the situation, people have to have the feeling that justice has been occurred, and I have the international right, personal right, to return to my country. It's part of the International Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that you have the right to leave your country and return to your country. So I have the right to return to Palestine. And I may not want to, I'm almost 80 years old, I probably won't return, but I want to know that I have the right to return if I want to. Until that happens, Palestinians will never feel justice has occurred. So, and I'm not saying I'm going to come back to my house and throw everybody out. That's not reasonable, but I must have the right of return.
I agree.
And I must have equal rights
Mhm.
across the board.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing, Gail. Yes.
I guess I addressed this question to both of you, but what drives your instinct for preservation?
Let me just talk about like what I found interesting about the book, or about her story actually, which is first someone who has lived through a traumatic event, you know, sort of inarguably the Palestinian story, national story of trauma around which their whole story revolves. Like in order to understand Palestinians, you need to understand what happened between November 1947 and 1949, this thing called Nakba, the catastrophe. If you don't understand that, nothing else will make sense. That sort of original sense of the story coming from that. For me, the interesting dimensions that I learned in the process of hearing her story were that first of all, Yafa's strange position in the UN partition plan of November 1947, that it would have been part of a Palestinian state, which is completely insane if you look at the map. It's a completely idiotic idea. You can't have states in the middle of another, or cities in the middle of another state and be functional, unless those states are confederated in some trustworthy way. And that's actually one of the possible solutions people have talked about. Is there a confederated model? Because this is a very small bit of land, and the real problem is, you know, obviously Palestinians feel unjustly treated, and obviously Israelis feel insecure, and not only feel, Palestinians have been unjustly treated, and Israelis are insecure in some ways, you know, right? So these are realities. These are overlapping realities. But so that, and then the last thing, just about, you're asking sort of about, you used a special term,
Instinct for
preservation. So what struck me too about the story is one of the debates in Israeli history between sort of revisionist historians and sort of older historians and sort of radical historians is like, to what degree does Israel bear responsibility for what happened in 47, 49? And there's a lot of debate about that, and obviously there's a lot writing on it from a state's point of view. If we're responsible for these refugees, then there are a lot of other things that come from that. But the fact of the matter is, at least in terms of the history, is that hasn't been resolved. In other words, there hasn't been, well, other than Ilan Pape, someone saying there was a Plan Dalet, which was the plan to remove, to dispossess, to create this refugee crisis. But what's interesting to me is in this document about the municipal archives, I mean, those archives are gone. No one knows where they are. And to me, that's suggestive of a thinking that in order for us to be able to hold on to this place, we do have to remove not only the people, but the memory of the people and the documents of the people. And that's the part that I think I would hope is part of the story that we talk about. Not that Israel bears 100% of responsibility, but what happened actually to those documents? Why are they gone? And what responsibility do we have actually for them and for what happened? So I was hoping in my poem to sort of extend this conversation and help us begin to think more about that part of the story. And that's the thing about memory for, you know, both Jews and Arabs, for both Israelis and Palestinians, is memory is so central to the sense of identity, and not just like recent memory, like memories and memories upon memories. And so that's also tricky when you have people for whom memory is the center of identity and not forgetting is the center of the identity. And I'm just inviting us to think about this little bit, like what's been forgotten, what's been erased, and how can we incorporate that into our senses of what's happened.
I'd like to add this is an American audience, and I want you not to think that this is a problem over there. Those nasty Israelis and those nasty Palestinians fighting for centuries, not getting along together. They have not been fighting for centuries. And it's the Europeans who came, and they happen to be Jewish, but they're Europeans. To me,
Well, and the mandate, the British.
and the British mandate, to me, if you want to lay blame and guilt, think about England, think about the United States. The United States carries a great deal of guilt over Palestine and Israel. We arm Israel. Why do we arm Israel? We foment wars in the Middle East, and Israel comes in very handy. And we're not interested in solving the human situation. We're using Israel, and the Palestinians don't matter. So it's a very complicated issue, and a lot of people have a lot of opinions about it. Think about it from a racist point of view. Think about the Holocaust. Why the Holocaust? Why did white Christians do that to the Jews?
I was also reflecting on the fact that our own history here has a lot of erasure. You know, like what monuments do we visit? Do we visit native, indigenous places here? Do we think of the land as indigenous? And we don't actually. We've erased that history too. We're good at erasing history, it turns out. Yeah.
And to add to that, they say that elephants' memory is in their DNA. They can pass to generations. Next generation will know a path to travel, though they've never traveled it. I don't know, is that possible? So I think that the indigenous people anywhere in the world, what if they had a wisdom of the soil, a wisdom of the land that gets lost when they get displaced? Empires are built, you know, labor is stolen for a pittance. It's an extension of what you said.
I mean, just another way, you know, sometimes we like to focus so much on this region, and there's a lot of heated resonance there for lots of different reasons. But you're all right that there's also in some respects, it's not unique, actually. I mean, this happens all over. And
like,
so
who would be turned to for the wisdom that lies in the land, you know, centuries ago? You know, the wisdom of the soils, you know, who would we
ask
turn
the
to?
Bedouin. The Bedouin are still, some of them are still there,
The
right?
Bedouin?
Yeah.
Right. Well, and the way they're being treated now. So.
No, I think it's important to go back in the history, much farther back than you have now. And what I'm thinking of is this region was controlled by Muslims from about 700 to 80, I'm being rough about this, to the time that Israel was established, except for a short period when Britain came in, and after the First World War, and took over the land and facilitated the colonization by the Jews from the Zionists, I should call them, from Europe. But the important thing, I think, is there's this long period of history where you had a Muslim-controlled area, and there was the Ottoman Empire that lasted 400 years, and it was destroyed by the British Empire eventually. But you need to have this long historical context, and I can go back even beyond that,
Sure.
to before the time of Christ, and it's a long, deep history.
There's a wonderful poet named Hassan Zaktan, who's a Palestinian contemporary poet, and he said something in an interview which I'll never forget, which was, he says, you know, the Jews have a history here, and it, you know, for them history begins at this period and it goes to this period. The Muslims, they have this history and it goes from here to here, and you know, the Christians have their own history here. And then he said something which is so powerful. He said, but I think in order for us to really belong to this place, that we need to belong to all of its history. It's 10,000 years of history. You know, places that have been inhabited for 10,000 years. And how do we belong? How can we belong, he's saying, in his place, but how can we belong to all of the history? And maybe even beyond that, how do we truly belong, not even to the human part of that history, but the land itself? I mean, something that we haven't mentioned here is that, I mean, the water is drying up in the Middle East. I mean, there's going to be a crisis from climate change just on the level of the water. And all of these considerations are, you know, we're sort of losing them in the face of this. So that's my desire when I am thinking about what I would invite people to do is just think about the widest possible sense of belonging and the ways in which we can dilate our own sense of what our connection is to place beyond the ways that maybe we were grown up into.
You know,
Can't we-
one thing about the population in Palestine, and when I talk about this. Before Jesus, Palestine was all Jewish, and then Jesus came, and then their Christianity and Judaism were at each other, and by 300 something, Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, and Christianity mushroomed and was the ascendant religion. What happened in Palestine, the population changed almost 100% Christian by about 500, 550. So what happened to the Jews? Did they leave? No, they became Christian. The Muslims came, and then the majority population was a Muslim. What happened to the Christians and the Jews? They converted. So that's how we share the history. You know, I probably originally, my ancestors were Jewish, and before that they were probably Canaanite, atheistic or not atheistic, pagans. So, you know, my ancestry, that's how I shared the land. And I'm going to jump now to something else Phil said about the environment and water. The Palestinians lived for centuries in Palestine. They understood Palestine, its rain, its deserts. They knew how to save water. And these Europeans came in and they brought in European ways of doing things. And it's a devastation on the land. They loved their evergreen trees, the European ones. They brought them to Palestine. They planted them all over. It ruined the fauna of the area. And then one day, there was a forest fire. And they weren't prepared for it. And it burned a lot of these trees. And they used it, by the way, to hide all the Palestinian villages they destroyed. So those trees really didn't belong in Palestine. They weren't the kind of tree you really should have in Palestine. But they brought them in. So their connection to the land, they're still connected to Europe, not to Palestine. So you're talking about the DNA of people. That's how it continues from it. It's through centuries of experience and living on the land. You know how to treat the land. You know what to expect from the land, and hopefully it doesn't mistreat you. But I agree with Phil. The water situation is a disaster. The Dead Sea is dropping, and there are many areas in northern Israel where the earth is falling because of the water table being depleted.
Really hopeful.
Sorry.
I wonder what you thought of the two-state solution. Do you think it's a solution at all? It sounded to me from your comments that you weren't thinking about a two-state solution.
The time for a two-state is past. The idea is a good idea. It'd be good to have a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, but Israel doesn't want that. Doesn't want it for a lot of reasons. If they were to make peace and have two states, they would have to make peace with people like me. Okay, they would have to make reparations. And somebody estimated it would be billions to make reparations. My father spent years of his life in this country. He tried his pastor, he tried the senator, Taft from when we were living in Cincinnati, he tried the congressman, he tried Fulbright, Senator Fulbright. They all told him, he tried the United Nations, he tried Israel itself, they all told him the same answer. We can't do any reparations until the final agreement, peace agreement. So, can't do anything about it. So it's not in the interest of the government of Israel to make peace. And they have the whole thing, why should they give it up? They want very much for the Palestinians to disappear. But they're not disappearing. So I think the solution is they have to learn to live together. That's the only solution.
One really a prophetic thing that David Ben Gurion said at the sort of outset, he said that we have three longings for our place. We long for a Jewish state, we long for a democratic state, and we long for a state that includes greater Israel, which would be sort of the biblical promise. And he said the problem is we know that we can only have two of the three. So which two will we have? And that's a sort of dilemma on the Israeli side, like which, because if you have the greater Israel, then you either include all the Palestinians as citizens, and then you potentially lose the Jewish character of the state, or you don't include them, and then you potentially lose the democratic character of the state. So there's a kind of the longing in the project of Israel is butting up against the different longings right there, I think is partly the way to say it. So it's complicated. But that's the way I understand it anyway. I could be completely wrong. I'm sure someone could disabuse me of it.
I'm not disabusing you, but I just wanted to point out that Zionism as an ideology, they considered Uganda, they considered Chile first before the Holy Land. And so I think that's an important factor too to consider, that it wasn't this one piece of land that had to be the Jewish state, that it was always a colonial project.
So some people obviously disagree with that reading, but in terms of the original architects, they thought our main problem is we are not safe in Europe. We need to find a home, and so where can we find that home? But obviously, the reason why they settled on that place is the historic connections to it and the ongoing existence of Jews in Jerusalem, and the absolute symbolic and central importance of Jerusalem to Judaism. I mean, it would be impossible not to. Do you know what I mean? Like, of course, political Zionism and religious Zionism are not the same things, but it was definitely the magic point of confluence for both goals, right? I mean. Yeah, they did consider Uganda, but they didn't go to Uganda.
The Christian Zionists, we can't exclude those people. They have this strange idea that all Jews have to go to Palestine, and there'll be a terrible war, and any Jew who does not convert to Christianity will be killed. So the choice of the Holy Land then makes a lot of sense. And these Christian Zionists were very influential in the British government. What's his name? Balfour was one of them, yes. So that's another aspect of the thing.
They have, when I was there, I noticed a few things. I noticed that the Palestinians had far more children than they did in Israel, in each family. And that has to be taken into consideration. I also noticed that when we were in the Palestinian areas, that many of the water towers were shot out deliberately by the Israelis, because that water, which is so sacred for all of us now, because it's disappearing. And I also noticed that when I talk to people from other countries, even if it's Canada, they have a different perspective than we have regarding Israel-Palestine. They're far more, well, you see a lot of them in Palestine, because their journalism is much more cohesive with everything, whereas here it seems to have basically a one-sided issue. So I try desperately to go into any other country to get the news rather than just this that's happening here, because it's more truthful out there.
I'd like to make a comment about the birth rate. It's not Palestinians versus Israelis. It depends on their religious affiliation. The Christians have the lowest birth rate, followed by Israelis who were not. I divide the Israelis into two groups. Those who are very conservative, they have their birth rate is as high as the Muslim birth rate. Now, you talk to a Muslim woman and she'll tell you, I need 3 sons, one to go to the United States, one will be killed by the Israelis, and one will stay behind and take care of me. If you were to have 3 sons, you have to have at least 6 children. And the birth rate is around 6.7 per woman, which is very high. The death rate for children is also lowest amongst the Christians and the non-religious Israelis. It's highest amongst the Muslim, and I'm not sure about the very religious Israelis. So, and the birth rates, sorry, my epidemiologist side keeps coming out. It's a well-known phenomenon of human groups that during war, the birth rate goes up. This is true in this country, true in Europe, and it's true everywhere. So that has part of it too.
Maybe one last comment, and then we should have some wine and baklava and the rest of it. So yeah, go ahead.
Kind of sidetracking everything we just said, but as a writer, is there a threshold that you reach at which point, like, you go, I really have to write about this? Like, is there a certain, I guess, level of engagement with a topic or with an idea that causes you to have like an almost reflex that makes you need to write? And if so, at what point is that for you?
There was this is going to sound really loopy, but hey, let's go loopy since we've gone so depressing for so long. I once visited an old teacher I said, I'm having a really hard time. My sister actually got married to a Palestinian man in the West Bank, and their relationship was floundering, and I realized I hadn't written anything about visiting and being at this wedding in this small village and how beautiful it was. And I said, I think I'm finally ready to write about it. And does this happen to you? She said, I went to my tarot reader. She said, the soul lags 7 years behind life. And that's my experience as a writer. It takes me a long time before I feel like I actually have a way of responding to my experience. I'm very slow. There are all these people who write about things that happened like today and yesterday, like the burning of the cathedral and stuff, and for me it takes forever. But then I know at that point that it's really inside me and it's not something that I'm trying to exploit or that I'm doing out of duty or a sense of, it's just coming from something really deep in me, and that's when I know, I actually start to hear words and phrases and voices in my head. Again, it makes me sound crazy, but I really do hear things. And that's when I know that I need to sort of give myself some quiet space to open up to that. And so that's a little bit of my process, yeah.
I agree with you. It takes a long time if you want to research a topic. I have my father's papers, and I'm in the process of scanning them and organizing them. My father was born in 1905 and died in 1998. His lifespan in the 20th century. And I'm planning to write a book about his life and the history of Palestine, and particularly in the first half of the 20th century. People hardly ever look at that, and it's actually quite interesting. I think about it in a sense. I'm writing different parts of it, thinking of different chapters, how I'm going to organize it, but it takes a lot of effort to organize everything that you need to put it together.
I know you're a writer, so just give yourself some time. That's my main thing, is like, be there, be present to the page every day, but don't feel like you have to produce something right away, because the good stuff will come when it's ready.
May I end with something? And it's a question.
I have a question.
Okay, 2 more questions, then we gotta eat.
Why can't we see that we're all members of a common human humanity?
That's a rotten king. Why can't we all just get along?
It's more than that.
Yeah.
Yes. That we have this humanness that we all share.
We're family,
We're a family.
10,000 years of history.
Why don't we wake up?
Yeah, well, do you get along with all your family members?
As a matter of fact, I do.
Well, we have to be like you then. Yeah, that's the predicament, isn't it? Nahida points out that there's these names. You can find families in this place, Israel, whatever you want to call it, Palace, that there are Muslims, Christians, and Jews, right?
Yes. Totah is the name.
Suleiman.
Slayman. They're Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
Yeah.
And they're actually related. It's not just a name, they're actually related. So.
Okay, your last question was?
The question was, you had mentioned something when we were talking about, excuse me. You had mentioned the Jewish character of Israel, afraid to lose the Jewish character. And that sent me into the Christian character of America, and yet these
Is it a dog or a cat? We just want to know. It's a dog. Okay.
He wants to be heard.
Yeah. Let him out.
Oh,
Free the dog.
but the distinction between, we talk about our heritage like as from a place, German, Irish, we're from a place, and yet when we throw things like Christian or Judaism, when we throw these religions in there, it's like it's something different. It separates, like Nahida was saying. They separated the place.
The old city.
What was it? Oh, Bethlehem. Into 4 centuries.
No,
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Well, and when we went into Iraq, we gave everybody an application and made them tell us what kind of whatever. We sorted them, and it just feels like we're losing that descriptor of place, which doesn't have the same separating characteristics that a beliefs have. So I just wondered what you thought about, even characterizing something as a Jewish character, or America as a Christian character, or whatever, as opposed to place.
I think my specific reference was just to the idea of Israel as a Jewish state that enshrined orthodoxy, and there's a whole set of aspects to that which I can't really get into. I don't really know exactly how to answer your question, simply to say that faiths do have places, and that's part of their character. And then some faiths have this idea that they're not bound to place, which I think is very odd. I don't really know what to say more about that, except that the thing that you did say that is powerful to me is the way in which people get named from the outside in ways that end up causing sowing division amongst people, and that's the part that that's really dangerous.
Yeah, but there is a lot of culture in a religion. I'm a Christian. I was born baptized a Presbyterian. I attend a Presbyterian church with my husband. I really don't feel comfortable in that Presbyterian church because I'm a Palestinian Presbyterian. So and the culture here colors the way you worship and what you do, and so you really can't separate place from religion for some people, or actually for anyone, for anyone. It's just maybe some of us aren't aware of it.
So I think probably both our books will be for sale, and we have some things to eat and drink in the other room. So.